Okay, so we are back for part 2, and we're going to talk about a few more things with respect to like characteristics of the progressive era. And so we left off talking about kind of like state level reforms. We were talking about things like initiative, referendum, and recall. Kind of moving us forward, talking about some other state reforms, things that they wanted to do. One of the big ones that, I'm not going to go through all of these, but one of the big ones that they wanted to focus on was trying to work towards the elimination of child labor and working on passing laws that would kind of limit child labor, and so that we could get kids in school. And so we have other things that are going to happen. This, if you can remember, this is that Triangle Shirtwaist, right? That big fire that happened. And so we're going to try to make some workplace reforms to make the workplace like a way safer place. And so we're going to do things like the 8-hour workday. We're going to work on having like improved safety, things like fire escapes, things like illuminated exit signs, things like that. We're going to have things like I talked about in class the other day. We're going to have things like workman's comp. And so if you get hurt on the job, you're going to get money. So if you get hurt and you can't work, then they're going to still like kind of be able to provide you with some money so that you can still kind of feed your family. Minimum wages. And minimum wage laws were not in place prior to the progressive era, and so that's important that we're setting a minimum amount that someone can be paid, and so that is going to improve conditions for labor. Of course, unionization and people joining unions is going to help improve conditions for labor, and then, of course, like I said, some of those child labor laws, trying to get rid of all that. And these are just some pictures of, some of the child laborers that were, in different industries around the country, around the turn of the century. So these are breaker boys, and they would have worked in coal mines. Kids as young as like 6 years old. So that's like little first graders going in and working 8-hour shifts down in the coal mines underground. We have shrimp pickers down there. You got a child laborer this is a textile industry here. They would have been kind of like, that's like a big loom for fabric. And then you've got glass works up top here. So kids that would have been working in a glass factory, which is really, really dangerous. And so another thing that we tried to work on during this time is working towards supporting immigrants and making sure that immigrants had what they needed to try to kind of assimilate into American society. And so this is Jane Addams, and this is her what was called a settlement house. And a settlement house tried really very hard to try to provide services for immigrants and help them with the things that they needed. So it taught them English. It taught them kind of like some like American traditions, like customs and stuff like that. It gave them job skills, and it gave them a place to stay, right? If they didn't have anywhere to go, they could stay at the settlement house and work towards getting what they needed to go out to be able to like work within American society, be able to communicate, utilize the language, all of that. And so these settlement houses were kind of like a reaction to all of the nativist sentiment that we talked about in class with respect to the quota laws and all that. And so these settlement houses were geared towards helping immigrants instead of making things more difficult for them. So settlement houses were a really good thing for immigrants. Another focus, and you guys are going to kind of go over a little bit of this if you choose to work on this, is temperance and prohibition. And so we have a couple different organizations, the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Remember, and you can kind of just take a look at the pictures here and get an idea that it says, remember, prohibition reduces vice, it reduces crime, it reduces poverty, it reduces what's called pauperism, which is like basically being poor. It reduces your taxes, and it increases happiness and business health. And so remember, they thought that alcohol was kind of the root of some of the evils in American society. And so they are ultimately going to get a constitutional amendment passed and that is the 18th Amendment. And so the 18th Amendment is really pretty important for you to know. We kind of already went over the 17th Amendment, remember, which was the direct election of senators. And so the 18th Amendment is prohibition. And so it's a nationwide ban on alcohol. And most people are not real happy about it. And so then when we get into the Roaring 20s, which you've probably already heard about, there's going to be a ton of illegal drinking that's going to take place as a result. And there's a lot of socialism at the time, and people who, like I said, were convinced that capitalism didn't really work and it wasn't really helping them, so maybe they should try a different type of economic system. And the dude that was kind of the leader of the Socialist Party is this dude. His name is Eugene V. Debs. His middle name is Victor. People sometimes see that and they think it's a Supreme Court case. It's not Eugene versus Debs, it's Eugene V. Debs. And he's a really important dude. He is kind of the leader of the Socialist Party, the leader of the socialist movement. He actually runs for president while he's in jail. He gets arrested for violating a sedition act or something like that, and he runs for president while he's in jail awaiting trial, and he wins like 6% of the popular vote, which is a pretty big percentage for somebody that was in jail waiting to potentially be convicted of a crime, which he does ultimately get convicted of. So we've got 3 progressive presidents. And so if you are asked a question about who are the progressive presidents, you got to know who they were and kind of what they tried to do. And so that's kind of the last big part that we'll go through today. And so we saw on the state level, we saw fighting Bob Lafayette and some of the changes that they tried to make. But on the federal level, on the national level, you've got Theodore Roosevelt, you've got William Howard Taft, and then you've got Woodrow Wilson. So Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. William Howard Taft is from Cincinnati, which is kind of cool. You can go down and see his house. It's in Mount Auburn, down by Christ Hospital. So Theodore Roosevelt becomes president in 1901. He is the youngest U.S. president ever. He's 42 years old, and he's an interesting dude. And so the questions are like, okay, so how progressive are these presidents? Like, how much did they actually get done, and did they actually kind of like fix all of the problems that we talked about, right? And so President McKinley gets shot in 1901, and like I said, Theodore Roosevelt, they call him the accidental president. And so he is a really kind of very outdoorsy guy. He's very kind of just like, he says what he thinks. He's very to the point, and he is going to begin to pass programs and stuff to try to help labor and things like that. But the biggest thing that he does is he is known as the original trust buster. And so this is a really good political cartoon here where his name is Theodore Roosevelt. He gets the nickname Teddy Roosevelt because when he was on a hunting trip, he loved to hunt. Some of the people that were with him basically like kind of took an injured bear and kind of tied it up so that he could basically like shoot it and have it be like a prize for him, and he wouldn't do it. He just thought that that was a horrible thing to do, and that if he was going to hunt, it should be like an actual kind of like, prize. And so because he showed the bear mercy, they come up with the teddy bear after him. So that's where we get our teddy bears, is from Theodore Roosevelt and the little bear that he spared that was injured. And so a trust is a monopoly. I repeat, a trust is a monopoly. And so when we talk about being a trust buster, you're talking about someone that's breaking up monopolies. And so he's going to try to attack a lot of different big monopolies. One of the biggest ones is railroads. He's going to attack railroads, and then ultimately he's going to attack oil. And so 2 of the biggest industries that we've talked about up to this point, Roosevelt will try to attack. Another big thing that he does is try to create and pass consumer protection laws. And what that means is that's laws to protect you and me as consumers. And so he read this book. He read this book by a guy named Upton Sinclair. And basically what it does is it highlights the nasty conditions in meatpacking factories. And it was really gross, y'all. Like, I won't even give you all the details, but people would lose fingers and there would be rat droppings and all kinds of things. And they would literally just throw it all into the hopper and grind it all up, and it would become like sausage. And so when he reads the book, he's just disgusted by it and thinks that he wants to, by the way, Upton Sinclair is one of those terms that we talked about called a muckraker. Right? So he was raking the muck to the surface. He was kind of making sure that people knew that there was this ugly part of society. And so Roosevelt decides to try to fix that and make sure that there were laws in place to make sure that people wouldn't get sick from the food that they could eat, and that they could eat food and know that they would be protected and safe. So, and we have this consumer protection laws now to protect people. So sometimes you might hear about how there's a recall of lettuce or a recall of whatever, a certain kind of meat or a certain kind of product, and that's because of these laws. And so the first one is the Pure Food and Drug Act, and that one basically called for truth in advertising. And in that one, basically, you cannot say, it says advertising, sorry. You cannot say that a product does something that it doesn't actually do. You can't lie to the consumer. And this one just basically made sure that meat was safe. So they have meat inspectors now to go in, because they basically were passing off meat that was bad. They would just bleach it, or they would put some other chemicals on it, and it was already bad and it would make people sick, but they were still selling it to the public just to make money. And so this law makes it so that you can't knowingly sell something that has already spoiled to the public. So those laws are really important, and those are some of the big things that he's known for. Another big thing that he's known for, y'all, is the creation of the national parks. The first national park was created in 1872, and that was Yellowstone. And so that's not Roosevelt. But the rest of the national parks that were created were kind of begun by the creation of the U.S. Forest Service. And so the U.S. Forest Service is something that he's going to create, and he will be responsible for the creation of Yosemite and a bunch of other national parks. And so we have him to thank for the idea of creating national parks, not just for recreation, but for making sure we were setting aside land to study the land, to study the wildlife, to study all the plants, the flora and fauna, and all of that stuff that was present. And so anything that you see that was created after 1901 was done, and within his administration, Roosevelt's 1901 to 1909. But anyway, he's responsible for a lot of national parks being created, and he really got the ball rolling for the creation of national parks in this country. Taft is progressive as well. He's one of our progressive presidents, and this is his house in Mount Auburn. It's literally right across from Christ Hospital, and you can go and see it. It's kind of cool. He also was a trust buster. He actually busted twice as many. 2 times as many busted trusts as Roosevelt did. So for that reason, he's even more progressive, and so he does break up a lot of monopolies. He does also kind of work towards natural preservation and all of that. And then there's another really important amendment that we've got that comes about during this time, and that's the 16th Amendment, and that's something that we call a graduated or progressive income tax. So if you are asked about your progressive amendments, progressive era amendments, the 16th is an progressive income tax. And what that means is the more you make, the more you pay. I repeat, a graduated income tax, it means the more you make, the more you pay. So if you are in a higher tax bracket, then you're going to pay more taxes. If you don't make as much money, you won't pay as many taxes. And so the 16th Amendment is pretty important, and it's still in effect today. Lastly, we have Woodrow Wilson as our progressive president, and he is a member of what's called the Progressive Party, but he will run under, he's a Democrat. And by the way, the other two, real quick, are Republicans, right? Roosevelt's a Republican, Taft's a Republican, and Wilson is a Democrat, okay? And so what he will do in the 1912 election, there's actually, and this is, remind me to tell you a cool story in class so I don't make this too long. Cool story in class about the election of 1912 when Roosevelt gets shot. It's pretty cool. But anyway, Roosevelt was running. If you kind of see, you have three different candidates, right? Major candidates. You've got Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft, and then Theodore Roosevelt decides to run again. And so you have three main candidates running. And so they really split the vote up a lot in the election of 1912. So because Taft and Roosevelt weren't cool anymore, that meant that Woodrow Wilson got elected. And so a couple key things before we end this one, a couple key pieces of legislation, progressive legislation that I want to highlight for you guys. This is a new, the Clayton Antitrust Act is a new anti-monopoly law. And this law is still in effect today, and it's a law that we're still using to watch companies like Amazon and Microsoft and all of those other, like any other of the big tech companies and all of that have been questioned and evaluated under this law to make sure that they are not kind of like too monopolistic, and so that's kind of a big deal. And then the only one last thing that he did that was kind of a big deal that I want to highlight for you guys is something called the Federal Reserve Act. And what that did, it's right here, is it basically created a banking system. This is banks. Okay, so it created a banking system in this country that had different regions, as you can see, right, according to this map. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So there's all these different regions. And so it created like regional districts for banks. And so that what that did is it stabilized sorry, not just focused in one part of the country. So instead, before we had our national bank here, right? And the green doesn't really work on this slide, but before the National Bank, the Bank of the United States was here. But by spreading it out and creating these regional federal banks, you basically kind of make sure that the economy in San Fran is not the same as the economy in Kansas City. And so by creating these different regional districts, you kind of balance out and stabilize and make sure that the economy is reflective of like the whole country and not just what the economy is like in this part of the country. So that's kind of a really big deal. You might not think that it is, but in terms of like stabilizing the economy and stabilizing people's money, it was a really big deal. So there's lots more we can talk about, but I know you guys are going to investigate through your research. And but as long as you know your progressive presidents, and as long as we know our progressive amendments, the only one we didn't talk about is the women's right to vote. But I don't want to steal that thunder from people that are going to research that. So we'll come back to that one in class if we need to. But those are the biggies. As long as you've got your progressive presidents and your state reforms with initiative, referendum, and recall, and as long as you understand what a muckraker was and what they tried to do, I think you're in good shape. Thanks, guys.